Gavin Ortland made a video saying the papacy is not from God. I want to do a video adding my 2 cents to the mix. I am not going to be like most of his people replying who are conservative traditionalists, so it might be a little bit unique. One of the major contentions regarding whether the papacy is from God in this debate often comes down to a question: was there a single bishop in Rome in the first century? I actually just saw not only very good evidence, but basic proof that there was a plurality of bishops in Rome, and that this is how Rome was governed until a single pope was elected and the Petrine authority was eventually placed on him. But that was actually just a couple of months ago when Pope Francis died, and there's at least 5 auxiliary bishops in Rome ruling in Rome until the election of Pope Leo, when the full Petrine authority is bestowed on the one bishop, Pope Leo. So there's nothing difficult about there being a period of time where there's a plurality of bishops in Rome before that Petrine authority is bestowed on one pope, one bishop. But however, the evidence indicates that, and while the evidence does indicate that there was a plurality of bishops in Rome in the first century, the evidence also indicates, Shepherd of Hermas indicates, that there was a leader of those bishops, that there was a head bishop of the bishops in Rome who was in charge of relations with the universal church. But even if that wasn't true, even if the plurality of bishops in Rome in the first century didn't have a head bishop, it's not impossible that you could have an extended period of time with no single head bishop in Rome. You can have, between the death of Peter and the election of a pope, you can have a prolonged period of time where there's just a synod of bishops before that Petrine authority is finally bestowed on one successor. And that doesn't vitiate the papacy any more than it vitiated the papacy a few months ago when Francis died and there was no single pope, there was no head pope, there was no head bishop in Rome. There was just a plurality of them until the full Petrine authority was bestowed on Leo. But again, the evidence indicates that there was always a head bishop among the plurality of bishops. Shepherd of Hermas again indicates that Clement was the head bishop of the Synod of Bishops, which I'm not saying that Clement acted like a pope, but that he was a head bishop and he was in charge of the relations with the universal church. That's what the evidence indicates. Yes, the evidence indicates there's a plurality of bishops, true, but it also indicates that in those plurality of bishops, you had a head bishop who was in charge of relations with the universal church. Okay, done. Next. Leadership in the church that comes from God. We all agree the apostles, those were leaders in the church that came from God. Now, I'm not going to argue this next point. I'm just going to assume it. But the apostles passed on their authority to the church. The leadership in the church that continues to exist from God is apostolic authority. Now, the apostles had Peter as their chief, so it makes perfect sense that the apostolic college of bishops in the church would have a Petrine head, would have a Petrine chief. Now, to this point, Gavin points out that Peter never acted like a pope in the Bible. And Gavin claims Peter never had the papal authority claimed for popes in the Bible. Now, universal jurisdiction. Did Peter have universal jurisdiction? Well, if Peter went to any of the ancient churches while he was alive, anywhere throughout the whole universal church, and he said, I'm going to make some judicial decisions about who's supposed to be your pastor, things like that, things entailed by universal jurisdiction. Would there have been any church in the universal church that denied that the chief apostle Peter had that authority? I find it preposterous to think that they would. So again, while Peter wasn't acting this way, going about acting this way, wielding it this way, nevertheless, I find it very unlikely that anyone would deny that he had that authority if he wanted to. Now, as far as infallibility goes, this is the other papal doctrine, we need to point something out. The question of whether the papacy is from God is a different question than whether the papacy is infallible. Even if the Pope was fallible and had gotten some things wrong, even if the papacy was so bad that at times it even acted like Satan, like Peter, that wouldn't mean it's not from God. Now, what are we talking here about? Popes acting like Satan and getting things wrong? Well, Gavin's made some touching videos, had some touching moments talking about some gravely wicked things that popes had sanctioned in the past regarding like burning John Hus at the stake. Man, that's pretty bad. And we needed to apologize for those things and correct those errors, thinking that it was good or right or licit to burn at the stake fellow Christians because they get some doctrine wrong. And the church has corrected that, and popes have apologized for that. But King Manasseh in the Bible, the king of Judah that's seated on David's throne, had the prophet Isaiah saw it in half. Did that mean the Davidic king was not from God? Would an ecclesial office overextending its authority, claiming to have more authority than it does, claiming it could never be wrong, but being wrong about that, would that mean it's not a valid authority from Christ? No. And I'm sure all of my audience can see, at least I hope I'm sure all of my audience can see that, at least logically speaking, the plurality of bishops in Rome in the first century, the Pope acting like Satan, even the Pope getting some things wrong, none of this logically means that the Pope is not from God. Even if the Pope is not infallible. Even if the Pope didn't have universal jurisdiction. Technically, logically, those are different questions than whether the Pope is from God. I'm sure most of my audience can get that. But then the question is, well, what good reason is there to believe that it is from God? Is it only this idea that the church's leadership comes to us from the apostles, and the apostles had Peter as its head, so therefore the Apostolic College of Bishops will have a Petrine chief? Well, that's a very good reason to believe it's from God. That's not the best reason. The best reason is what we would call the motives of credibility for the church. If we are trying to compare different church structures that exist in the world, different churches, to see which one has come from God, the theological tradition, the spiritual tradition, the intellectual tradition, even the miracles and the saints of that church in communion with the Pope, that church with the papacy, that far surpasses any other Christian tradition. Now, I love some Protestants. I think they're living saints in the Protestant world, and then the Catholic Church, the Pope, the Catholic Church in communion with the Pope. We can learn from the Protestants and the Orthodox, and they can teach us some things. But when you're evaluating side by side those traditions and the Catholic traditions and the Catholic tradition, there's really no comparison. The depth and richness, the utter profundity and depth and richness and nuance and complexity, the brilliance of the theological tradition, the spirituality, the spiritual tradition that has this piercing scalpel and this mystical beauty. It's like, and even just the raw size and magnitude and global spread of the church. This church in communion with the Pope. All of these point towards and demonstrate and show that this church, this office, this structure is from God.